Whatever yours.
Sure.
All right, hello, folks. Welcome to the last session of the this track, and I think at the conference. So, thanks for sticking around for the afternoon. Try to keep this a very lively and informative discussion and debate. I think you will not be disappointed. We have a very illustrious rogues gallery up here. And I'd like to also welcome those of you who are watching remotely. I think you'll also find this a very interesting and informative session as well. So my name is Dr. Rick Forno. I am the director of the Graduate Cybersecurity Program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I'm also the assistant director of our Center for Cybersecurity. I came to UMBC after 20 years in the industry, mostly in an operational role in network security, network operations. Also had a strong policy bent, moved in academia, and basically want to give back and kind of share the lessons learned to help educate the next generation in terms of not making the same mistakes we did. With me on the panel here as well is another fine academic, Professor Andrea Matwyshyn. I always butcher your name, I apologize.
No, that's fine.
Professor of Law at Northeastern University, and was the former senior policy advisor at the Federal Trade Commission, where she just looked into cybersecurity and consumer protection type of stuff, and she may touch on some of those later today as well. At the far left, or my left, your right, is Pat McDonald. Pat has a long career in cybersecurity operations as well. He's been a security engineer, he's been a NOC manager, he's been a security manager, and he's now a technical solutions, technical programs manager at Google, where he's looking at various privacy solutions. So the way this talk today is going to flow is, we heard earlier, is anybody in that talk this morning about information sharing? The first session was in this room before lunch. Okay, we're going to build on that talk. In particular, that looked at information sharing broadly at a very policy high level. And what we're looking to do here in this session is drill down a little bit into some of the operational and practical realities of information sharing, particularly vulnerability disclosure of security vulnerabilities and cyber risk. But underscoring our comments today and the discussion with you is that many of these same items transcend into other disciplines, whether it's chemical plant security, any industry involving risk. Okay, there are questions of risk communication and risk disclosure. But this panel, again, is going to focus on cybersecurity risks, but just bear in mind that a lot of these things do transfer into other disciplines and industries as well. So to kind of set the panel up, I'd like to take a few minutes and talk about the issue at hand of vulnerability disclosure. This is one of the perennial debates, very polarizing in many ways, in the security industry, going back 20 years or longer. And what it really comes down to is how much information about a security problem should be told, under what conditions, to whom, and when. And this debate has really become distilled into three general concepts. The idea of full disclosure, meaning I'm a security researcher or a vendor, I've discovered a problem in a product or service, I'm going to tell the world everything there is to know about this vulnerability. Maybe release some code showing how it works, what we call proof of concept. And if somebody takes that and weaponizes it, oh well, I just want to get the word out there. That's what we call full disclosure. At the other end of the spectrum is what we've come to term responsible disclosure, or the sense that the researchers or those who find vulnerabilities and exploits will first work with the affected product vendor to determine the scope and severity and impact, and let the vendor investigate and possibly develop a fix in a timely manner before the researcher then discloses it. Some have argued this is almost akin to blackmailing. We're going to report it to you, and if you don't respond within 30 days, we're going to tell the world. Consequences be damned. That's another option. But some vendors have taken a very proactive and responsible view of responsible disclosure, and will work with researchers to ensure that their interests are met in keeping the vendors informed, and the public is kept informed of vulnerabilities as they're discovered and remedied. And many companies have what they call responsible disclosure policies governing how these actions take place. So you got these two extremes. And in the middle is the responsible disclosures. Full disclosure, zero, and then zero. Zero disclosure. As the name implies, we're not going to tell anybody anything. I've discovered a vulnerability, we're to keep it to ourselves. Or I'm going to only tell the vendor in question, and if they disclose it, that's up to them. Keeping it very secret. And there are advocates and opponents in all three of these categories. And this issue, as I said, it's going on for 20 years, has yet to be resolved. 9/11 brought this idea of information sharing again to the forefront after the terrorist attacks in a big way. Things like outages of cellular phone networks were suddenly kept secret because the government did not want, and phone companies did not want terrorists to know, well, the scope of a cell outage in a certain town, because that might help them plan attacks. Chemical plants were removed, the location of nuclear power plants were removed from public reading rooms and maps. I thought that was kind of funny. How do you remove a nuclear power plant from public knowledge? You can drive along the road and see a sign that says power plant next right, see the cooling towers, but it's not on the map. Well, a terrorist is going to find a way to find out where the power plant is, even if it's not on the map. So the issue of vulnerability disclosure and, broadly speaking, security disclosure, risk communication, came back in a big way in 9/11. But the underlying question is, does this really work? My colleague at the Stanford Center for Internet and Society, Jennifer Granick, coined the term, this can create the possibility of a cybersecurity 1%, where we have a select group of individuals or companies that know all the vulnerabilities, and those end users and smaller businesses who are not part of that 1% are kept in the dark or have very limited awareness as to what's going on. And that has the problem of creating some issues of trust and bad blood and operational problems in the internet industry, generally speaking. So this morning's panel talked about information sharing and how can we facilitate government and private sector to share information about cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And I asked a good friend of mine who's been very involved in cybersecurity vulnerability research for years, Brian Martin, about this. And one of his comments to me was, well, when chinchillas are outlawed, only outlaws will have chinchillas. Meaning that if we suddenly keep all the vulnerabilities secret and we develop policies and processes that keep information under wraps, then the only people who have this information will be outlaws, and this information becomes criminalized. The problem is information is fungible, and information on the internet in this day and age is not easily constrained. So even though you believe you're keeping a security vulnerability private within a certain group or a cartel or a public-private partnership, there's no guarantee with certainty that information will not get out through other means, or that somebody else somewhere in the world is not going to discover the same vulnerability. So then you've got two distinct paths here, where on one hand, there are those who believe that vulnerability sharing of cybersecurity information can be constrained in a way that only helps the good guys and keeps information out of the hands of the bad guys. But by contrast, that's not a guarantee. As we heard this morning, one of the problems with vulnerability disclosure and information sharing is that this seems to be the preferred solution. Over years, whenever there's been a security incident, and we've had many in recent years, the first go-to action is, let's go ahead and create some more ways of sharing information. Because sharing information will be the answer. If we can exchange vulnerability information privately, that'll help. And it may, but it also may not. This goes back to at least the mid-90s. And we see that this every couple of years, these solutions are presented repeatedly. The question that we have to face as a society, and a democratic society, is that where does cybersecurity vulnerability disclosure draw the line between maintaining security and having that balance of keeping security awareness and maintaining security in practice? Depending on who you talk to, you're going to get folks at either end of the extreme who believe that all information should be disclosed, or those who say information should be totally restricted. The problem is, and I'm quoting someone who wrote one of the most popular network security programs in recent times. He says he doesn't have the stamina to further debate disclosure processes or the ethics of disclosing vulnerabilities anymore. We've been doing this fruitlessly for decades. I'm happy enough with the status quo, which is very little regulation of the process. Sure, I can think of regulations that might help force better behavior by vendors, but I think any new regulations are more likely to make things worse by censoring security researchers, independent researchers. He also added that there is this perception that information, again, should be kept quiet, kept secret, versus going back to the idea of zero disclosure versus full disclosure. The bottom line, he argues, is when we talk about vulnerability disclosure, who are regulations or processes likely to help? And we need to bear that in mind, whether it's going to help the internet community generally, or is it skewed towards business interests? In the panel this morning and some of our comments today, we'll talk about some of those initiatives and how they do skew the discussion and the benefits more towards commercial interests than true operational security enhancements. So I'll leave it there as for now as a way of just kind of kicking off the discussion to kind of illustrate the high-level issues that we're facing in the security industry. Whether you're an independent researcher, a security engineer at a company, a government person, this affects various levels of the industry, but brings in issues of civil liberties, privacy, censorship, freedom of speech, the nature of information and knowledge. There are so many angles of this that in some ways it's not surprising why there is yet 20 years on no clear-cut answer to what is the best or preferred way of dealing with vulnerability disclosure in cyberspace. We'll have some more things to say about this later on, but I want to turn the floor over to Andrea, to Patrick, to kind of come at this from his view in the operational world of vulnerability disclosure, where he's actually done vulnerability research and gone through these procedures.
Okay, so you can tell I'm the operations guy because I'm the only one with a can of Red Bull at the table. I apologize if I butcher names. I'm worse than Rick at that. So my first introduction to the responsible disclosure, full disclosure, such debate came back in the end of 2001, 2002, when Matt Conover of the Woo Woo Group released an AOL bug right on Christmas. And the much younger me went on a very fiery rant because I couldn't believe that people were mad at a researcher publishing information that would help people to protect their system. Now, I wish that younger me had the older me to be able to go ahead and describe much better what I was feeling, how I felt. But as an operations guy, you spend numerous evenings, for lack of a better term, on the wall, watching the hordes trying to break in, trying to prevent the people you're protecting from opening the door and inviting the hordes in. And you do this in the dark, completely in the dark. So any information that we could receive, wherever it comes from, whether it's a very poorly written, hey, I found the bug in such and such, so at least I know where to be looking for a new attack. Or, hey, this is completely vulnerable, here's the POC, I can test the POC, I can prove it, and I know there's not a patch, I shut off services. In my role as a network and security manager, I took advantage of, with the latest OpenSSL vulnerabilities before patches were released, of maintenance windows where I told customers, yes, we're going down for maintenance, took those services offline, not because we were doing maintenance, because it reduced my attack surface and lowered the window of exposure until a patch came out. So Rick talked about my experience in doing vulnerability research. And as an advocate for researchers and them being able to disclose, one of the things I repeatedly got told, both in my work as a government contractor and then my work in the private sector, was a lot of vendors believe that their product is a unique special snowflake. When combined with this unique special snowflake of a researcher, that was the only way the problem would be discovered. It was this magical combination. And so if we could censor the researcher, the problem would never be rediscovered again. Well, I hate to disappoint them that doesn't be the case. In my work with the OSVBD, as I was mangling vulnerabilities, going ahead and adding the information to create a robust vulnerability database, You saw tons of emails on SecOps lists, on full disclosure and such, that listed different people finding the exact same vulnerability through different paths at relatively the same time. About 10% of the entries that I mangled, and I mangled thousands, had this case. Now, I had some insight into it a little bit more as I came to work the vulnerability disclosure programs for C2FO. We did both HackerOne and BugCrowd, and we would get multiple submissions coming with POCs. Interestingly enough, some of these POCs actually included from different researchers the exact same.
Can you clarify what a POC is for those?
Sorry, proof of concept. The idea here is to demonstrate that not only is the vulnerability real, but it's exploitable, so that somebody outside the network can actually use this to create the effect that they claim. We found POCs that contain the exact same MD5 checksum. So even if the researcher is a special and unique snowflake, they're sharing this information with their fellow researchers and friends, who are then also sharing it with us. So even if, as a vendor, you could censor the researcher, it's already been shared. It's already out on markets that are completely unavailable and accessible for us to contain. So looking at and going ahead and following up, Dan Gilmore brought it up in the information sharing question. What incentives do we want to place out there for researchers? Well, the incentives that I see most associate with are not good. We had Dimitri's arrest at DEF CON 9. We had Weave, the AT&T hacker, who apparently AT&T doesn't realize that simple addition is a very easy way and skill available to all of us. When I moved out to Kansas City, the first OWASP KC meeting I attended, Steve Jensen was speaking about application security. And he referenced that on a return flight home, his flight got canceled, and so he had to make a change to his reservation. On his reservation, he found a vulnerability in won't mention the airline, but it was Denver, so you can go ahead and take your guesses, that they had a vulnerability in their mobile web app. Steve did the most responsible thing I could think of, immediately called and began to try to talk and say, I found a security issue with your system. Rather than being met with open arms, an appropriate redirect to maybe the right department, or a, hey sir, here is our process on how to submit these issues, he was met with attacks of lawsuit. He was met with attacks of fines, censure, and everything else. We can even go through into our own industry, the security industry, just recently with Jean-Marie Bourbon and FireEye, where Jean-Marie went ahead and posted security issues with the FireEye security product. Here is a vendor that makes its living off of security disclosures by other researchers to provide signatures, to provide understanding of what attacks are out there. FireEye went ahead and contacted the researcher's company and censured the researcher by getting them fired from their profession. And lastly, we have good old Oracle. Mary Ann Davidson, the CISO for Oracle, went on a rant that is best enjoyed with a tall glass of alcohol and a large sense of humor, that they didn't need researchers examining their products for security vulnerabilities. I'm going to read a Bruce Schreiner quote, which I think sums it up very, very nicely. It's easy to just mock Davidson's stance, but it's dangerous to our community. Yes, if researchers don't find vulnerabilities in Oracle products, then the company won't look bad, won't have to patch things, but the real attackers, whether they be government, criminals, or cyber arms weapon manufacturers who sell to government and criminals, will continue to find vulnerabilities in her products. And while they won't make a press splash and embarrass her, they will exploit them. The only thing I can think to say to Ms. Davidson is that as somebody who used to mangle for OSVBD and deal with the quarterly Oracle reports, is I wish she had come out with this announcement much, much earlier and would have saved me many hours. Now, not all disclosure programs, not all vendors are villainous towards researchers. Kimberly Price, who runs BugCrowd, which goes ahead and does security disclosure for a lot of companies, gave a great talk at Black Hat. and brought up something that I think is very, very important, that if nothing else, if you provide no monetary reward, if you provide no material award of, hey, here's a cool t-shirt to wear, swag, or even a Hall of Fame award, the best thing that you provide with those programs to researchers is a social contract that says, I won't sue you. Just the fact that you promise not to litigate and attack goes ahead and allows these researchers to come up from the underground where they are going to either sell to the highest bidder, or as Rick said, I'm going to keep it and exploit it and run around with it until somebody else finds it and closes it, and allows them a venue where they feel safe. It doesn't have to be a cash reward. I worked for a company that went ahead and ran 2 programs. I could never convince my superiors to go ahead and shell out the cash for it, as I worked a one-man security office. But most of these researchers simply want a kudos so that they can take it and establish a portfolio so they can then go ahead and show a future employer, you want proof that I understand security, application security outside of the theoretical, I know to patch my systems, etc. Here's my Hall of Fame report for this vendor. Here you can see that I understand cross-site scripting because I found it in this application. It's publicly available. It's a great portfolio. You have vendors, Brian Carter, a good friend of mine, works very extensively in bug bounty programs. Found one on a shopping cart site that he frequents, reported it to the vendor. Vendor gave him a 5% coupon. Didn't cost the vendor anything other than maybe a couple cents on the dollar, and they got a several $1,000 bug closed. You have security teams that find employees. Facebook posted back in August of 2013 that they had 2 direct hires from their bug bounty program. As a security researcher, as a person who's run CISO style duties for a company, it's painful not to have this research, particularly in the public. It's painful not to be able to leverage this research. BugCrowd offers a fantastic way to do that, and that they encourage these researchers to participate as part of their Flex program. The idea here is, rather than having a single point in time penetration test, you take their certified body of researchers, you pay out a particular amount of cash, and it's a free-for-all. Whoever finds the best vulnerability wins the payout, and you can have a tiered structure. And from there, they go ahead and divvy out, they do all the attrition for you. To give you an idea, NetSecret posted on Twitter as part of his SecretConf talk, we weren't sure on a bug bounty program. We spent $200,000 on pen testing, found 11 vulnerabilities. $48,000 on a bug bounty, 66. Chris Trainer, who is a sales rep for BugCrowd, when he was convincing me about the program, had me talk to Joshua Lung. Joshua works for a company that already goes ahead and publicly posts the result of their penetration test, gave the Flex program, the responsible disclosure program on BugCrowd, a try. They went from 6 vulnerabilities found in their pen test, and we'll say that the pen test was a little lacking on what it found 9 times those vulnerabilities with a 2-week Flex program test. So you have the ability here to leverage an incredible amount of people from locale who speak different languages, who don't necessarily use a system in the same way your researchers or your staff would, that bring a great amount to the table. And vendors, not all of them, but most of them are doing everything they can to drive them to the ground, whether through their own legislative practices or through government legislation, which they're going ahead and manipulating and leveraging to go ahead and continue to drive these guys underground.
So you can get a sense here that there is still 20 years on the debate is raging in the security community, but then it also does trickle more broadly as far as cybersecurity issues fitting into national security, public safety, and security considerations as well. That may explain why vendors are in some ways heavy-handed towards lobbying lawsuits and after researchers. I mean, I'm sort of proud to have been accused of one myself. I have got a DMCA takedown notice about a Cisco vulnerability on my wall at the home office. It's a mark of honor. Okay, but the word still got out, even though it was removed. This was removed from the internet. The word still got out. How much easier would that vulnerability have been resolved under a different set of circumstances and different processes that work with researchers instead of treating them as the enemy because the information was deemed, proprietary? I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, so following up on those themes, if I may, I'd like to take us forward with a laundry list of some thoughts for possible methods for improving the current situation, as I see it, from both a public and private sector perspective. So the first kind of big picture point that I'd like to share with you is that focusing on vulnerability disclosure processes in isolation of the big picture of information security issues will unfortunately lead us to a suboptimal conclusion. It's really a system of moving pieces that all need to be addressed in tandem. And so one of the most important points that is a linchpin of this system is the concept of leading by example, both in the private and the public sector. There are many things that are common in the information security challenges that both public and private sector entities face. And so working internally to get oneself up to speed and be the secure organization that you're hoping to see elsewhere is the first step of this. To that end, we see sometimes conflicting definitions of what good security means, not only in the private sector, but also in the public sector. If you look at the way that certain agencies operationalize their self-defined mission in context, there can be some tensions. I might point us to the recent encryption backdoor conversation, where in the name of security, there were different operationalized paradigms at play that sometimes directly conflicted. And so depending on which agency you talk to, you might get a different analysis of the desirability of those programs. Creating a common language, both in the public sector and across the public and private sector together, is the first baby step we have to get to, or everything else will fall in on itself later, unfortunately. The second baby step is learning to assess risk accurately through perspective taking, which is something that the most sophisticated security professionals have certainly been doing, and we've been hearing some of that. So thinking about how attackers view your organization, whether it's public or private sector, and creating internal structures for reporting and correcting known issues. We all want to improve. We want to build better products. We want to provide private sector or public sector services more efficiently, right? So creating feedback loops in the ways that we see, for example, the new ISO standards on security, articulating some of the best practices of what sophisticated organizations do, that's the next step. And that has to come from the top. In the private sector, it's the C-suite in the private sector that needs to dig in and address those issues and secure things top down by making it an organizational priority. Same thing in the public sector, top down organizational priority. For concrete suggestions and self-assessment, I might point us all to the new FTC Start With Security document, which has a list of 10 very basic questions that go to the question of whether an organization has reasonable security measures in place. It's just a starting point for this conversation, but unfortunately, many organizations can't answer yes to all of those 10 questions, and that's a great place to start. So building structures, both organizational and product structures, in better ways involves technology suitability, knowing who your users are and knowing who your customers are. So I call this partially a better with bacon problem. Sometimes we think that by incorporating a new technology or a new bonus functionality onto an old technology, we inherently have made it better, the same way that an overzealous chef might sprinkle stuffed bacon on all the things on the table. But the problem is, if you're dining with a vegetarian, that means the meal's been destroyed for that person, right? So it's about thinking through what actually makes things work better for all the constituents in this conversation, all the stakeholders, if you will. So more connectivity is not always better. And security pros will tell you that in many cases you want to engage with things like air gaps and setting aside data protected from connectivity. That might not be the intuitive move from the standpoint of someone who's trying to create organizational efficiency and make all those searches of the 28 years of employee data faster. But perspective taking, 28 or more years of data in a single database for your employees makes you a very attractive target for compromise, right? So more connectivity, not always better. And usability is a piece of this. Do the people who are interacting day to day with the technology understand how the technology works and what the risk profile is? And one really potent lever that we can use here is the power of government procurement. So updating procurement standards to incorporate security concerns in a meaningful way would nudge the market to generate higher quality products that are more secure out of the box and interact with users in a more intuitive way. And that then brings us to the theme of the disclosure conversation around meaningful information sharing. So that's the linchpin of the to-date paradigms that we're trying to leverage in DC for the most part. But the challenge is that we risk putting the cart before the horse if the necessary pre-existing structures aren't in place. So what does this mean? It means fixing pre-existing flaws in what we have today. One type of flaw that we have today is a lack of security metrics driven by a lack of coordinated processes around the format. So this is a formatting issue. It's like the memo that you're writing for your law firm or the specs that you're writing for your product. A formatting issue around security advisories. We don't have a handle on how vulnerable we are across the private sector or the public sector because security advisories are frequently not written in an optimally usable way. So to allow for metrics to be created around the reality of our vulnerability and our disclosure processes and our fixing of existing flaws, one of the first steps is to have a conversation around the drafting and the presentation of security advisory information. Without meaningful security advisory information being shared when vulnerabilities are found, the vulnerability aggregators can't aggregate and push out that information to allow for other people to get access to that information and meaningfully patch their systems. So it's all interconnected, right? And one of the key elements that I've heard from aggregators is a problem is an inadequate identification of embedded libraries in vulnerable products and when vulnerabilities impact libraries. And so this is one possible goal for the current NTIA disclosure process that we're in the middle of. I think it would be a fascinating and potentially manageable goal to talk through the optimal format of presenting security advisories after a code creator has identified and acknowledged that there is a flaw that they are in the process of fixing. So the communication in a standardized way to allow for information sharing and aggregation. So I think that's a low-level, uncontroversial, well, for me, uncontroversial step that would greatly facilitate our more sophisticated conversations in these ways. In particular, I'm highlighting this because the inevitable burgeoning of IoT vulnerabilities, when the Internet of Things really permeates our society thoroughly, the current structures for vulnerability reporting, the CVE system and others, will have a very difficult time scaling. So we need to start experimenting with thinking about these scaling problems for a different kind of society that we're building that is very technologically connected with pervasive vulnerabilities, because IoT vulns, it's the high-end technology product vulns kind of ratcheted back 10 years, right? Because there are no screens. It's hard to run any kind of app on them to look for existing viruses or anything by the consumer. So it's really about building well on the front end, and yet these are entrepreneurs who are sometimes operating on shoestring budgets too. So the IoT space presents a lot of complicated issues, but around the question of disclosure, I think it's important for us to recognize that without creating good structures, we're not going to be able to scale successfully for the challenges that the IoT explosion presents to us. So this is really about creating meaningful feedback loops, and security research is one of those meaningful feedback loops for vendors and for our society. As our physical safety increasingly relies on code in our cars, in our medical devices, etc., we need to have structures in place to create consumer confidence in these products and to offer, for the good of our society and our economy, the highest quality products possible, especially when we can find flaws in the code. We all hopefully want to make them better, right? So the legal regimes that in particular would hopefully engage with and perhaps evolve to address some of the currently challenged feedback loops that we have include the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and we're currently in the middle of a triennial rulemaking process, and the Copyright Office and Librarian of Congress are considering exemptions that include specific security research requests. Full disclosure, I'm the lawyer in class 25, which is security research exemption. And so having the legal toolkit that is sometimes leveraged to aggressively silence the researchers that we, the grand we being all of us as consumers of technology, would want to hear from and would want to facilitate our feedback loops, closing down the opportunities for strike suits and strategic litigation to silence researchers. That's a part of the creation of this meaningful feedback loop process. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, troubled statute that we're all undoubtedly familiar with, 3 circuit splits in the federal appellate courts on this statute written in 1986. The world is very different from when it was in 1986. And so Congress did the best it could in 1986, same way it did the best it could with the DMCA, but it's time for us to examine the emergent consequences of technology nudging these statutes into the society that we have now and where we want to take it going forward. A component of this may be, for example, around mitigating the CFAA uncertainty that we currently have, centralization of CFAA prosecutions in DOJ rather than leaving discretion to individual prosecutors throughout the country. That would help to give a coherent approach to the DOJ position on CFAA prosecutions, and greater transparency in making indictments more readily findable for researchers to be able to get counsel from their attorneys as to whether the conduct they are potentially engaging in may be perceived in their jurisdiction to violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So empowering attorneys to be involved in this cycle is part of what's missing as well. So these are some of the feedback loops that will help to create not only product improvements, but also structural improvements in both the public and the private sector. Other ways that we haven't tried to create good incentives, for example, particularly with the challenges that we're going to face in security vulnerability in IoT products, phased out tax incentives for entrepreneurs to get them up to speed with security. It's something that would be hopefully a win-win in terms of both consumer protection, providing higher quality, neat gizmos in the marketplace, and making us all less vulnerable in the process. Creating tools to help both public and private sector entities do supply chain integrity assessments, figuring out where your vulnerabilities really lie and whether embedded products that you are getting from other places may expose you to unintended or unanticipated risks. That could be a technology assisted solution or something that the agencies that are involved with data security could assist the self-assessment process, both in the public and private sector, through some guidance documents working with experts, for example. In addition to those, and I don't want to take up too much time. How much time do we have? Okay, so here's just a few other thoughts for us to discuss. The SEC has started to engage in more evaluation of its October 2011 guidance around material disclosures of incidents. The approach of additional disclosure I'm a fan of because, full disclosure, I wrote an article advocating that 7 years earlier. So I think they're going to continue to engage because investors care about these issues. And I've had hedge funds and others come up to me and say, how do I factor in vulnerability in my assessment of the risk profiles of the companies that we're investing in? So there's interest in the market and on the street in this. Other things I'd like to see, a technology solution to data breach notification. I think an aggregation database would go a long way in that space. I'm not sure we need a legal solution necessarily as a first cut. I think a nice database to eliminate inequality of information about breaches across jurisdictions would go a long way. Limitations of liability, it's too soon. It's going to create the wrong incentives to limit liability. No, we shouldn't do it. And the last point, and this is something that I think a lot about, and I'm working on a book on it, we need to realize that sometimes natural tinkering of, for example, children with technology may look on its face, that conduct may look on its face as if it is an act of DMCA circumvention or an act of CFAA unauthorized access. But we want to encourage our kids to tinker and innovate. And they are surveilled in ways that last generation of tinkering kids were not surveilled. And so we have a little bit of a collision course here happening between encouraging our kids to tinker and innovate and increased surveillance by the gadgets themselves of what is happening to them. And so if we want to build a next generation workforce, particularly in security spaces, we need to create a safer environment for kids to learn about these processes. And so having alternative punishment structures that give judges flexibility to assess what the intent was behind the tinkering is a component of this. Having, for example, felony-only CFAA convictions will kill much of the next generation of the tinkering children, and that's not good for our innovation economy, even if, in the opinion of some legislators, it may act as a deterrent, which we need to have that conversation in society, because I think that these are complicated issues that are not as crisp as they might be in some other legal contexts. And I'll stop there and we can discuss.
The joys of academia is that we can pontificate for hours and hours on end, and we have to actually pull ourselves back from the edge every now and then, otherwise we hear snores. So this is a very complicated issue, and there are many stakeholders, involved in this. This has been an ongoing concern. And we've seen new proposals to deal with it. This morning we had the panel talking about the information sharing, some of the initiatives therein. But yet, if you notice in the hearings that go into the public testimony, much of the folks who are providing testimony are industry and vendor representatives. They're not necessarily security researchers or operational folks. They're representatives of the vendors who will be directly affected by whatever information sharing, vulnerability disclosure practices or laws are put in place. So there's an asymmetry between vendors on one hand and those who are doing vulnerability research and disclosure on the other hand. And we need to find a way to better equalize the level of public discourse so that those who actually have boots on the ground, so to speak, in this discussion are at the table in a meaningful way and not relegated to the third speaking spot on the third panel session on a day of hearings. They need to be up front and center on panel one on C-SPAN with everybody in the room, watching them and hearing what they have to say. I would also add that we need to be vigilant. And there are groups, at this conference and in other places and many academics watching what goes into these bills and these proposals to make sure that public interest and public security and privacy and civil liberties aren't preserved. We have to be vigilant. A lot of this is done through nonprofit NGOs. That's helpful. Okay? But we need to make sure that as these bills are promoted and discussed officially, that there's that balance. The big controversial moment in the CISA is that one phrase, notwithstanding any other provision of law. That's terrifying to civil libertarians and others, and I think rightfully so. Okay? If we weren't watching for that, that probably would have snuck through and nobody would have had a second thought about it. So we need to be vigilant about how we're approaching the idea of vulnerability disclosure, because how we approach that may then have follow-on consequences far beyond cybersecurity itself, going into privacy concerns, mission creep. What is cybersecurity information? What is vulnerability information? Could that be then extended to include other types of computer-related crimes, intellectual property, monitoring, things like that? Okay, we have to be very diligent, and that requires vigilance. And then finally, before I open it for a quick public discussion here, we have to be mindful about public-private partnerships and what I call the cult of classification. There are a lot of shared technologies in the private sector as well as the government. There's not an exclusively government way of securing the Windows system. Okay? We need to make sure that information is deemed a vulnerability or cybersecurity risk information is not automatically classified and kept out of public view, or people who stumble across it through various legal means are prosecuted one way or the other. Okay? Some stuff needs to be kept secret, absolutely. But there is a heavy-handed shift towards classifying and keeping secret, which then does have a chilling effect on security research and security vulnerability disclosure. In a democratic society, that can be problematic, especially when you start talking to lawyers and you get into First Amendment discussions. So I don't have a clear answer as to how this will be resolved. It surely won't be resolved today. But the panel, we certainly welcome ideas and thoughts to how we might approach looking at this issue. Are there opportunities for discussion that we've missed, that we as an industry have missed? Are there things that we've ignored? And with that, I'd like to open it up. We have a few minutes remaining for any comments, questions, or observations about this situation and what we might be able to do about it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, Drew. I work at Access. And I have a question about the government's own vulnerability disclosure policies. We saw recently that the EFF released the Vulnerabilities Equities Process policy document that didn't really go into too much detail, but the federal government has claimed that they released the vast majority of vulnerabilities that they discovered, but it's not yet clear really what that means. Like, what are the vulnerabilities that they do keep? What are they using it for? What type of vulnerabilities are those? So I'm wondering, what is the broader impact on the culture of disclosure when the government is having its own lack of transparency and potentially advanced disclosure policy? And then maybe, do you have any thoughts on what the government could do policy-wise?
So one of the biggest things I found as somebody who worked in disclosure programs was a very clear, very concise disclosure policy to include what you considered a security bug, what qualified as a correct submission, what you released, how you released it, when you released it. Transparency here is key. Particularly in the case of the government, which got, through Snowden, caught with its hand in the cookie jar. They don't have a credible leg to stand on when they say, we've released all the exploits, but please ignore all these releases over here showing ways that we continue to manipulate and exploit. Transparency, audits to go ahead on their end to show that, yes, you know what, we can see that you've received these submissions, you've received these discoveries, whether through private sector, public sector. They have to open up and let people know. It's the same way vendors have to open up and let people know that, hey, yeah, here's how our process works, here's how submissions come up. Because what happens is, otherwise we get things, EII had a great bit where they would show, here are vulnerabilities we've submitted to various vendors, and here's how long it's taken these vendors to respond back. And it wasn't days, it wasn't weeks, it was months to years on how long they would sit and just wait, languish. And yeah, okay, maybe they're not weaponizing it, maybe they're not using it, but they're not doing anything constructive for their public, their constituents with it. And that's, I think, kind of the real answer is demonstrate to me as a person who's subsidizing your vulnerability disclosure program that you are serving the public interest. And yes, I understand that by helping to patch that, that may help to serve various American enemies, however you want to classify them. But you have to serve me, your constituent, first.
So,
On that notion, I was wondering, what are the differences and what is similar between whistleblowers and security researchers? I mean, there are some similarities.
that's a question for the lawyer, I think.
Well, so part of the challenge is that different bodies of law treat whistleblowers differently. So it's a great question, and I think it's one that we need to think through as a society about our overall approach to these issues. In the private and public sector, this is one space where arguably there may be slightly different concerns. But you've highlighted one of the key definitional differences across bodies of law in the way that different agencies reward or punish whistleblowers. So, for example, the IRS and the SEC financially reward whistleblowers. Other pieces of the government and private sector entities sometimes definitely don't financially reward. The companies that use bug bounty programs, for example, if you want to view security researchers as a form of whistleblower, then companies with bug bounty programs are financially rewarding. Companies who are issuing legal threats are not financially rewarding. So I think you've highlighted one of those areas where we're lacking a common language and discourse, and it's one of the initial important conversations that we should have in building out a sustainable set of emergent feedback loops for security.
Okay, we got time for one more question here, and I see your hand over there.
I want to ask how you think civil society organizations should approach disclosures if they discover that they've been hacked or if they have a malicious actor within their systems. Should they come clean at the risk of maybe damaging their credibility with their constituents, people who are confiding in them confidentially, or how should they let that play out?
I think a lot of this comes down to questions of perceptions and public trust. And if you are affected, if you're a civil organization, or if you're an organization that is affected by something major, a data breach or something like that, I think you have an obligation. It's that social contract that we were talking about before, to let your constituencies know what's happened. You may not need to be specific, but you need to at least say something happened. You may be. I mean, who here has not received free credit monitoring for at least a year? Okay, we've all received that. Okay, we've all been told we're part of a potential problem. Okay, so I think that's the correct approach. At least it's giving us some information that we as individuals can monitor our own lives and see if we're affected. So I would err on the side of selectively disclosing that there's a problem, but you don't need to come out necessarily in open kimono. I think that's going a bit too far and may well cause problems down the road for your constituents.
So one quick test that I sometimes tell private sector companies, if you were walking up the stairs in someone's house and they had a stair that was going to collapse under your foot, would you want them to warn you? So if the vulnerability is serious enough that it is functionally a severe source of potential harm, then there is likely an ethical, maybe even legal duty to warn people in a way that prevents them from experiencing that harm. So that may not be providing a 6-page technical summary of all of the mitigation maneuvers, but it does involve likely telling people how not to be further injured by interacting with you.
Yeah.
And there are instances where private sector entities have simply taken their sites down with a warning placard. We're working on it. We've been alerted that there is a risk of attackers on our site. To keep you safe, we are down. We'll be back up as soon as we can. I think at this point, everyone who reads the news knows that we are all just doing the best that we can with security issues, and that some types of vulnerabilities are not predictable. So even if you are engaging in reasonable care and doing everything right, you're still sometimes going to get hit out of nowhere. But the question is how you handle it. And the best mitigation is neither to entirely hide it nor to have engineers running down the hall screaming, right? It's having a process in place and to provide at least as much information to help people not be newly injured because they're interacting with you.
One of the one of my professional areas is incident handling. What happens when these incidents occur, and keeping your head is one thing, and keeping your people informed certainly plays a large role in that. A good example is how US CERT used to do advisories. Years prior, in the 80s and 90s, when it was the CERT CC up at Carnegie Mellon, they would put out CERT advisory. Techies, engineers, we'd be involved in these documents, and they were technical. And they were, line and verse about how you would fix the problem. Lay people don't understand that. They need to know, okay, there's a problem in my Windows widget, whatever. I should turn this off, click here, and do that. They don't need to know the low-level technical. So what US CERT did when it was stood up, it created a two-tiered system where the lay people, my mom, would get these alerts, very high-level general and understandable to a mass audience, warning them of a potential problem. And if you were an engineer or a techie or a security person, you could subscribe to the more technical vulnerability alerts from CERT, from US CERT, which would give you that information that you would get, but your Aunt Tilly really wouldn't understand, nor should she care about. But it was a way of making sure that the communication, the message was received by the constituencies based on their level of perception, which kind of ties back to what Andrea was saying about, having the right framework in place so the message gets out in a way that's understandable and meaningful in terms of warning and sharing information. So I know we're coming up on the end of our session here. We'll be around for a few minutes afterwards. I'd like to thank everybody for staying awake and not throwing things at us. And we wish you a pleasant rest of the afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you.